Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today in Edinburgh, where we are hosting our discussion panel in honour of World Green Building Week, focusing this year on building resilience. I should add that this session is being recorded and will be made available via Cundall's YouTube channel, where you can also find the recordings of all the other events we've been hosting around our offices globally. The focus of World Green Building Week this year is on building resilience, recognising how this interrelates with addressing climate change, but also understanding the impact on people and how this sector influences the economy. We are increasingly recognising the importance of this as we progress through the pandemic, but also as we start to approach COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference in November this year, which is taking place in Glasgow. This couldn't be at a more pertinent time, where Glasgow has experienced its hottest summer since records began in 1884, and globally we've seen the hottest July on records to date experienced this past year. So as we have the headlines of this past week regarding the energy crisis and rising fuel bills, I think we can agree there's still a lot to be done if we are to keep our temperature rise limited below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we're all familiar with how we need to make our buildings more sustainable, but Scotland specifically has set world-leading targets to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. These are legislated targets, which means we are bound by law to achieve these, and everyone is going to have to play their part in contributing to this. So, in the context of the built environment, which is responsible for 40% of global emissions, resilience is obviously going to be a key focus of this. So we'll be touching on how we think that will fit into the approach that the sector has taken forward, but we're also going to look at the role of regulation, as well as how we as individual organisations are approaching the problem. So please do use your Q&A box and on your Zoom application, and we will spend some time at the end going over a question and answer session. Please submit those as we're progressing through the discussion. There will also be a poll available, so it'd be great if you could submit your answers on that as we proceed, and we'll look at this responses once we get to the end. So without any further ado, Sophie Simpson, so I lead the sustainability team in the Edinburgh office for Cundall, but I'm going to allow the panellists to introduce themselves and give you a bit of background about their experience and their areas of interest. So I'll start with Christina at the end.
Thank you, Sophie. That's appreciated. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So my name's Christina Gaiger, and I'm a practicing architect here in Edinburgh, and I'm also the president of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, known as the RIAS. And we're the professional body for all chartered architects in Scotland, with a really key focus, especially this year, on create, build and protect. So it's supporting the membership to help deliver on Scotland's targets, but also work very closely with Scottish Government to support working groups and focus groups to help them actually develop regulation and policy. There's a huge amount of expertise throughout the membership, but obviously there is still a long way to go in terms of how long it takes to deliver a building and how long we have to achieve our targets. So that's been a real focus of the RIS. I'm also very, very passionate personally about VAT parity, which plays a really, really big part in terms of the retrofit and reuse of our existing materials and building stock. So fantastic to be here today. Thank you.
Pass over to you, Jo.
Thanks. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you. My name is Jo Dunwell. I'm an architect at Bennett's Associates, also practicing in Edinburgh. I've worked on a range of projects at Bennett's, both cultural, educational and commercial. Myself, I'm a member of our in-house sustainability team, and as a group we look to continuously develop our own sustainability targets, which include things about the way we run our practice, but also the way that we run our projects, some of which are science-based targets. We also review our own project work as a group, and we look to carry out further research, particularly at the moment on embodied carbon emissions for theatres. Personally, my focus within that sustainability group is health and wellbeing. I'm a well-approved professional, and I look at our projects with a particular focus on health and wellbeing.
Thank you very much. And Tina, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Tina Muldowney, and I'm a landscape architect, and I'm one of LUC's design directors based in our Edinburgh office. I've been working in private practice for nearly 20 years, and I've delivered a wide range of projects across all sectors. I'm currently leading a number of rural and estate regeneration programmes, green infrastructure strategies and place-based master plans. I strongly believe, like you, Joe, in the link between human health and wellbeing, and that there's a strong link between population health and the health of our planet. At LUC, I'm surrounded by a fantastic team, and I've got, as a company, we've got a strong heritage in sustainability, and I think this mindset was almost fostered by our founder, Max Nicholson, who is a pioneering environmentalist and a founder of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. As an organisation, we've set a strategic action that by 2025, we want to be one of the UK's leading advisors on climate change mitigation and adaptations associated with land use and landscape. And as an organisation, we have made commitments to change our working practices through reduction in carbon and offsetting to make us carbon neutral by 2030, and we've pledged net zero as well. We're one of the signatories for that, as well as the landscape architects declare a climate and biodiversity emergency as well. So for me, what's even more exciting, I suppose, is that we've made some commitments on how we actually deliver our projects. So we're thinking about everything from our business travel to the materials we specify and our supply chain. So we really want to create legacy landscapes that are resilient and adaptable to climate change.
Thank you very much. And Mariana, last but not least.
Hi, good morning. I am Mariana Trusson. I am currently the Group Environmental Manager for Phoenix Group, and I am in charge of delivering the net zero operational target for 2025 for the business. So my role involves everything from strategy on how to act as a business, how to operate and so on, to figuring out the tiny energy consumption of a tiny little office in a tiny little location, because everything is important in terms of every little helps in terms of getting to that net zero target on the one hand, but also it is important to identify that different actions in terms of organizational practices can offer different impacts with respect to carbon. I've also written a book a while back on whole life costing for sustainable building, looking at the secondary and tertiary impacts of actions that are not necessarily costed and not necessarily measured in terms of carbon as well, and how you can look at the whole picture and see what actions and how they can reduce your end goal, your carbon footprint. And ultimately that's the kind of thing that we're using in Phoenix, where we look at the overall impact of whatever we're considering, and then we're prioritising based on that.
Well, thank you everyone, and it's great to have you all on board today. So in order to just jump straight in, I was wondering if anybody wants to give a bit of context about how their experience and discussions on resilience in the industry.
Everyone's going to look at me. I think it's a really interesting topic. First of all, starting with the word resilience. So it's interesting, when I lived in New York, they used the term resilience in terms of actually coping with disasters and impact on the city, in terms of actually how they were going to regenerate and restructure themselves. And I think it's interesting that we're applying resilience in terms of our built environment going forward, because are we actually looking at a mass restructuring and a mass kind of a different perspective on how we are going forward? Do we have to re-adapt? Do we have to adjust all of our practices? Is this actually an emergent response in the same way? So I think even the word resilience and how we are approaching that as an industry going forward is so critical, because actually if we are serious about a climate emergency and we are serious about a resilient approach, it is a change to all practices. And how do we achieve that? So the way the RIAS is approaching this is through working with Scottish Government, as I've mentioned, in terms of support for membership, but we're very aware that it's kind of totally intersectional in terms of the public need, consumer need, industry need, insurance, and actually it goes right the way through. So how do you, it kind of, my mind explodes a little bit in terms of actually how do we approach that, and what's the role of the building industry and the built environment in kind of driving that forward? Because actually there's a huge amount of expertise there that can really have a loud voice and drive that conversation forward. I think that would be sorry, I've gone a bit on a tangent there, but I think it's that word resilient, and are we really serious about what that means and the implications of redefining everything in order to move forward? I don't know who wants to pick that up. Sorry, I've not left it very open.
No, I think it is, though, to a degree, because going to that definition of the word, you see outside whereby it is the aspect of resilience, the aspect of, for example, the impact of climate, the impact of climate change. It's calculated in the billions as a result of an impact to a city or to a location. Whereas in the UK, in a little bit more, it's not. It is the impact of the climate on a particular building or on a particular building owner, or it's not. So it's not looked at on the whole. So you can't really compare apples with apples when you're looking in the industry. But also what it means is we had floods over the summer across many places. The impact of those floods, when you want to be resilient against climate change and you want to show resilience against a climate impact, the first thing that you would think of is floods. So as a building owner, as a building designer, you would do everything you can, but there is always a time when you think, well, actually the infrastructure could have been a bit better, or this connection could have been a bit better, or so on. And so I think there is a step missed there. As you say, elsewhere you have a more holistic approach. It takes everything into account. Whereas here, it's not as such. There's still a very much delineation between, this is a public purse and public decisions and so on and so forth. This is the private purse, private decisions. And that communication doesn't seem to be working, especially when you're looking at climate resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're certainly finding that for us in our kind of project work, that there's two aspects to that resilience. There's one that's almost like responsive retrofit, dealing with the issues that we're now seeing happen, like flooding, and trying to deliver better green and blue infrastructure. But it's also about how do we make our estates and our places actually more future-proof going forward. So we're kind of trying to deal with immediate impact, but also we really need to be switching on to thinking about how do we sort of preempt the next sort of stages, what are the next major events that we're going to have to consider as well. So we're obviously looking at that very much from a landscape focus.
And do you feel that kind of fits in with the movement towards kind of whole life carbon, considering the lifespan of the building? Like, where can that kind of better inform the decisions being made?
Yeah,
I think within the context of a project, we're also talking about the wider picture, but then in that kind of smaller scale, I think it should be the case that everybody that's involved with that project should have their own responsibility in accordance with what their contribution is. Mm-hmm. So as an architect, you design coordinator, that would be part of your role. Yeah. The same thing for everybody, other design consultants and of course the client and so on. In a similar way to health and safety. So health and safety are the same, would be everybody's responsibility, not one person. Yeah. Sustainability should be the same. And that's the only way, I think, that it would become intrinsic to the way the project is run from the start.
Yeah. So almost like, you could almost set up a risk register and a set of ambitions and goals that everybody has to sign up to and that everybody's kind of actively managing throughout the process.
I think it's that risk as well in terms of going back to that global market and that value. It's turning it's getting that emphasis on actually there's a value to doing this, and it's linked to social sustainability as well in terms of the health and well-being. There's that bigger picture. How do we create better places? How do we create, how do we actually sustain the planet? And there's how do you quantify that value? How do you communicate that? And I think that's a really important tool that's starting to trickle down in certain industries through risk maybe, but actually even for homeowners now with changes that are coming in, I think we're at a turning point where that value could become quite material, and so we're at an interesting point.
So where do you think then the driving forces come from behind that? Like, for example, like within like a portfolio, like if you can look at the individual building, but if you're looking at a portfolio of assets, then what are the kind of driving forces influencing the decisions being made?
Well, it's a combination. One is the biggest one, especially in a portfolio, is the value of the portfolio. If it's not resilient, and then you lose half your stock next flood, it's not ideal for everybody. And so the value needs to stay, but also all the things that come around that, its usability, its usefulness, its longevity, and so on, because you want the economic aspect to be sustainable as well. And we've already said, if it's not economically viable, then by definition it's not sustainable. I think there's a bit of a difference between the definition of economically viable, but when you're good about it, you can say. And so one is that driver. The other one is increasing scrutiny in terms of what you are doing for climate change resilience, for resilience in general. And that scrutiny comes both from the market as a whole, from your peers, for example, but also from any clients and other stakeholders, because climate change and sustainability are becoming increasingly more prominent in people's minds. And people like us, we've been in the industry, for decades, but it's not necessarily something that we've been seeing consistently. It's only now that started. And so it's impacting on business as well. And that scrutiny is a powerful force because, I always talk about, your consumer power, but it is really powerful in terms of creating making people take decisions and so on, and creating momentum in a particular way. But then there is regulatory requirements for clarity and for going into detail about how are you, Mr. Individual, Mr. Business, and so on, how are you dealing with the resilience aspect? How are you pulling your load? How are you helping everybody else? And so those are the three basic drivers.
Well, that takes us on quite neatly then to consider how we kind of want to see the role of regulation. Is that something we should be dependent on, or should we be performing beyond the regulation? Like, how does that fit into helping us kind of get over the line?
I think it's really tricky because you can't help but look at the example of carrier bags and charging for carrier bags, and the impact that everyone now knows that if they forget a carrier bag, they've got David Attenborough in their mind, they're sitting on their sofa, they can picture the implication of forgetting that carrier bag. It's very, very material and it's very real. And there's a value to it, which mounts up, actually, so it can be significant. So I think it's actually regulation helps make that real in terms of actually that monetary decision and that consciousness for everyone. And the difficult position that we're in with regulation at the moment, from my perspective, is not moving fast enough in order to deliver on the targets that we've set. So, for example, in Scotland, there is a lot of work being done around Section 6 and Section 7 of the building standards and the technical handbooks, but actually the software is a little bit behind. And then, you're waiting 6 months or a year, 18 months for software to catch up, or measurement, or how we're measuring carbon, or anything like that to catch up Whereas actually we've got a very finite amount of time to respond to this and quickly. And it was really interesting looking at the RIAS awards this year, which were actually a lot of the briefing documents were written kind of 7-8 years ago. So they're quite carbon conscious in terms of the fact that actually their brief and the regulation that they're adhering to is actually already outdated. So, but that's the time span of a building, can be a decade, can be beyond that. So actually when you look at that going forward, we're in quite a critical position to actually making some really hard choices, which is difficult because there's a direct economic impact of that coming in at regulation level that is looked at as a whole. So I think we're at a really key point essentially, but I don't have the answers for what the next step is, but I think there's a lot of pressure to actually for the regulation to jump and to leap forward, but we've got to take everyone with us on that. The Scottish Government's got to take everyone with them, and the planning framework is a really good example of actually from a health and wellbeing perspective how it has really leaped forward. And there's a lot of community empowerment, there's a lot of financial packages going into actually recognising the spaces between and the peripheries of buildings, so that's happening. But from a regulation in terms of technical and carbon performance, especially outside of just emissions, it's really quite concerning in terms of that overall view. Sorry.
No, not at all. It's really interesting.
It's a really tricky subject, I think, because there's a temptation to think of the regulations as baseline, which shouldn't be the case. I think it should be a high standard, which we all should be upheld to. But on the other hand, it's incredibly difficult to create these measures, as you said, because a lot of the way that we calculate carbon is complicated or doesn't necessarily exist yet. For example, existing buildings, it's incredibly difficult to calculate the carbon emissions, especially whole life carbon for an existing building, especially if that existing building is very old. So how do you set a standard for that? You can't have a one size fits all approach to this with building regulations. So to a certain extent, individuals are going to sort of do that, are going to push further than the regulations will require. So I guess the challenge is to create that balance by setting a high standard, but also making it applicable to any particular project.
I think there's something about the language that's quite important here as well, as by making the regulatory process effectively changes it from an ambition or a suggestion to a mandatory requirement. So I think that's where we have to shift as well in terms of our approach and our mindset. So as you say, it's not just the baseline. It's not but it's something more sort of positive and proactive, I think, than that.
We don't want to be working to a minimum standard.
No, exactly. And I think we've all seen challenges with things like BREEAM and trying to use a kind of a checklist and a tick box and how that presents some challenges and that it can focus drivers in a particular direction and it's not necessarily holistic.
So there's perhaps a need for kind of more innovation then perhaps, and is that something you think, like, is there opportunities with like the local authorities who are declaring climate emergencies and setting targets, like can they help in any way? Like what could be used to kind of support encouragement of that kind of peer pressure to innovate?
I think it's also the acknowledgement that the building regulations and that's there. It's a minimum standard and it's guidance, but actually it's getting back to there's value in going beyond that, and it's taking everyone in that process on that journey, and then it actually links to everyone taking responsibility. So no professional in that environment should be wanting to kind of run at a baseline standard. We should be trying to, for our own individual responsibility, push as far as we can. And sometimes there are barriers there which are really difficult, but I think it has to work on both fronts. So even if the regulations don't take the leap they need to, actually the profession and trying to take consumers and clients with you has to try and come above that, even though, you know, you shouldn't be aiming for that minimum. And I think it comes back to, you know, is this climate change or is it an emergency? How are we responding? So it's that need, I think.
I think there's also an issue with a tipping point. Yeah, because it's a balancing act whereby regulation almost jumpstarts a very reluctant society to do something, like 12 years ago, however much, when the EPCs came into place. And then you have all of this issue about upskilling and doing and getting everybody on board. The timing of these changes is also very important, but you have all of that, and that generates a baseline and a structure for things to then move on. And then at that stage, if you time it right, then you up the ante a little bit. Now, okay, everybody, you ready? We got you ready.
Brace.
Now let's step it up a gear. And I think in a couple of situations, that timing has been wrong, and that the overall look of it is not ideal. However, I think the intention and the process and so on is valid, and we shouldn't sort of poo-poo it. It's almost about fine-tuning and tweaking the way things are going. So you've got the minimum energy efficiency standards, for example, which you can argue about their effectiveness and their impact in reality, but it does address existing buildings. How well is beside the point. It does address existing buildings. It does move organizations and owners to do something about said existing buildings and get them working. And then it also creates another upskilling of society, whereby you have a lot of your trades and well, the building industry as a whole to working really hard to getting existing buildings more energy efficient than they were 10 years ago or 20 years, you know? And that is a skill that we didn't have, because we had been focusing very much on the new build.
Yeah.
And we had, perhaps because it's the easy option, not taken the refurbishment as seriously, but now we have to. Because otherwise you'll either get 40% of the building stock all of a sudden just being demolished, which is not ideal because we don't have time. Or you'll get 30% of the building stock being really, really improved because people have to.
Yeah, yeah.
Very true.
And then also, I guess, we can look at it from individual buildings, but obviously the built environment, it represents beyond that. And so where we've got like a lot of expertise, for example, here in relation to health and well-being. So beyond carbon, what are the other metrics that we should be considering as well when we're looking at a resilient solution?
Yeah, it's interesting we're talking about the existing buildings. There's a recent Edinburgh Carbon Commission report that says that by far would be the best solution for Edinburgh 2030, beyond anything else, including reducing cars. But yes, there's a balance there, because when we're living or working in these existing buildings and they're not performing as they should. And you know, that health and well-being is kind of a separate subject to sustainability, but there has to be a balance there, because if it's not performing well for the occupants, then it's not sustainable. But they're actually kind of at odds with each other at the same time, because you know, in order to improve the air quality of these buildings, quite often natural ventilation isn't necessarily a workable solution. So, but then, you know, there's always a balance there about how efficiently these systems are working. So it's something to consider, I think, as part of that. I mean, this isn't just a straight, you know, is the building net zero carbon? What's it kilowatt hours per meter square per year? And there are other aspects to it, and I think the way that the building is performing once the work has been done it should be part of that equation. if not literally, then at least as part of the thinking.
I guess from our perspective, we like to think about it as a whole ecosystem approach. So right from the beginning, when you're at the briefing stage with a client, what we need to be doing is thinking about that whole life cycle, but also thinking about that particular site, not the building need, but what does that site, what capacity does that site have to accommodate development in the first place, and how, what are the existing issues that site may or may not have in terms of flooding, for example, as we've mentioned before, and then it's trying to build that into our kind of design rationale and our design thinking, everything from how we're actually delivering our schemes and our projects. So at the construction stage, trying to minimise specifying stuff that's going to have a high sort of intensive programme of watering and irrigation, for example, but also thinking about the kind of future lifespan of that project and how the impact of what we've created might or might not have downstream. So, more hard surfaces, more building roofs, obviously have an impact on our catchment and the kind of wider downstream flooding and things like that. So I think it's that whole approach across the ecosystem that we need to be considering.
I think with health and well-being as well, it has to be brought back to the reality of fuel poverty in Scotland as well. And I suppose it links back to the earlier mention of the energy prices and everything that's happened in the last 2 weeks, because the focus really is on emissions. It's not on embodied carbon at the moment. Yeah. And that is fuel poverty and emissions have a direct relationship. And then in terms of how we are approaching health and well-being, it's fabric first. It's about concentrating on that envelope, on investing in works that'll actually last and have a lifespan, as opposed to technology that's maybe 8 to 10 years, for example. So actually it's trying to think of health and well-being in terms of actually, again, quite holistically about actually how someone might be comfortable in a space, but not just looking at it from a mental health perspective, stress and bills and actually warmth and comfort, really, really primary needs. So I think they're quite, although they're very different in terms of how we might approach them from a technical perspective, I completely agree. I think it's quite interesting when it's almost like a basic need. They're very, very linked.
Yeah. Well, there's two strands to health, isn't there? There's community-based and population health, and then there's the acute health needs that you have if there's something wrong with your health effectively, but actually having the foundation in place for people to have healthy, active lives, good access to energy, good access to food and other kind of things as well. So yes, I think they do go absolutely side by side.
Some very interesting points. And I think the other element that we were looking to discuss today as well was understanding how our organisations kind of fit into helping be a solution. So for example, we've focused heavily on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So what are our emissions on site? What's our purchased energy? But then we've got this whole challenge of understanding our scope 3 emissions. So, and for like a kind of real estate management, then that can represent up to 85 to 95% of total emissions. So there's still so much to learn. Like how do you think as an organisation we can contribute to being part of the solution?
I think, well, for us, we're looking quite closely at the way that we manage our business in that sense. In fact, at this very moment, they're having a discussion about it, Bennett Associates, about where we are, where we've come to in the last 2 years in terms of the way we report our own sustainability. And this is about the way that we manage our practice, our offices, our premises, our staff. But it's actually, as architects, we need to be setting a standard for the, who we're making recommendations to. So it's important that we are leading the way on that. And the way that we've done that is by setting out a series of targets to do with our premises, the way that we manage our projects, and the way that we manage the people that are part of our team, with some quite specific, goals to meet, and we're measuring ourselves against them and reporting it publicly. And as I said before, some of those are science-based targets, which means that they're verified against that standard. But there's always an opportunity to improve on that. So that's why it's not just a case of just discussing it once and putting it in our policies. It's got to be a continuous process. And it goes right from, as I said, right from the way that we manage our projects to actually looking at our own personal carbon footprints, which is quite terrifying to see once it's all set out, but it's well worth it.
I think, I'd like to think we're all working for organisations that are very much switched on to that kind of approach, and I think it's not without challenges though. And I don't believe the supply chain is quite ready. We're having some problems with availability of materials, even plant stock for projects, but also, equipment that we're ordering for, upgrades to our offices and things. So we can set some ambitious targets, but we need others around us in the wider industry and supply chain to be ready too. Because what it's doing at the moment is kind of narrowing our choices in things, and really we should be opening that back up.
Good point.
So in our attempt, and I think it's always it's a bit like yoga. It's always a practice rather than an end goal, right? Because you first of all you baseline, right? So you've got your scope 1, you've scope 2, and then there's umpteen scope 3s, and so you take a deep breath and you dive in. And you've got your waste and your water and your suppliers on one side, and your tenants upstream and tenants downstream, and business travel and commuting. And last year, the working from home aspect.
That was soft all.
And the working from home and balancing all of these and understanding what the numbers are, and as you say, the materiality of it, which one is bigger than the other, but also looking when you're in an organisation the size of Phoenix, you look at these numbers and you think, oh my God, they're big because it's a big organisation, and so you have a lot of suppliers, and your investment footprint is quite significant, but then so is the working from home, because you have a lot of staff, and then you kind of think, well, what can I as an organisation affect? What kind of steps can I take to start reducing it gradually? And you always look at it on a longer term, because none of the things that you can do, beyond the stuff that you do for scope 1 and 2, for example, turn things off, none of the things that you can do on those scope 3 emissions have as an immediate an impact as you can do. And so it's all about strategy and policy, and then adjusting it. But also, as you say, with suppliers and with your relationships with other people, is almost how can we influence? How can we get the wider market that we're working in to sort of come with us and help us attain our goals by helping and influencing their behaviour change, if that makes sense. So you go to a supplier and you say, well, have you got a net zero target? No. Would you consider one? You listen to somebody else and said, well, actually, we think that this is a good way of doing it, and then you take it back and you perhaps try it and so on and see how it goes, and pilot upon pilot upon pilot of things and see what fits. But one thing that I do know is that it's not a 5-minute job, is it? It just takes, and you have to plan it for 5 years in advance.
Yeah. And I suppose I'm coming at this from a bit of a different angle in terms of representing a membership organisation. It's actually looking at how do you take the whole membership with you? Actually, what do the membership need? What skills are we missing? What expertise do we already have, which is already quite exceptional in Scotland? So I think it's looking at actually listening to that upskill need, those gaps, even right from education. I know there's a lot of work going on there at the moment, but there are still gaps between education and practice. and how do you actually kind of support those needs and bring everyone with you. And I think that's really key. And in terms of the supply chain, it's always hard when that value decision is made for a much less sustainable or healthy material, for example, based on cost. And it's often because the more sustainable or the natural or the breathable material there's not the demand for. And actually, how can we tip that balance, and make sure that it's the more sustainable material that's actually, doing well in the marketplace and it's the go-to. So I think it's that change in attitude, but from a membership perspective, it's actually about trying to identify the skills and tools that professionals need to actually, be able to take clients on the journey with them, to be able to look at their own carbon footprint, to be able to assess their own businesses and actually be part of that driving force. It's a really key aspect.
Okay. Well, just a reminder to everyone to make sure you've got answers submitted on the poll, which we'll hope to look at shortly. But also, if you've got any questions, then just to get them in there, and we'll try catch those if I can get the laptop at some point to see what the questions are. But yeah, I think one of the points that we had was that it was like timescales is really important. So understanding those timescales in relation to regulation, but as you were saying, Mariana, the timescales in relation to kind of getting people on board, engaged, and taking them over. So, kind of, what would be your recommendations that people should be engaging with now to kind of help them for 2030 targets, 2040, 2045?
Interesting one for me. This is probably your area of expertise, Marianne. But if you consider for a project the whole life carbon, then that you might look on that on a timescale. So the timescale starts when the project starts on site, and it goes off into the future. And if you say that it's net zero carbon, how long is it actually going to take to be net zero carbon if you consider all the embodied carbon cost of construction as well? And the answer is not in 2 or 3 years' time. Generally, it tends to be much longer than that. What we are now, 2021, and we're looking at Edinburgh 2030. So, is that project going to be, balancing by the time we get to that date? Possibly not.
No.
And I think we need to be honest about that personally. I think it needs to be considered as part of that factor, even though that's a difficult thing to say, because it means that those targets are suddenly much harder.
I think what you're saying is that I think the carbon modelling is really important to kind of inform and for us to be aware of, and it's part of our decision making, thinking ahead with it. But for us, it's a very blunt instrument at the moment, and what it's not taking into account is things like, other effects that project may have on, health objectives or biodiversity or flood resilience. If we're focused on carbon and embodied carbon, it's very difficult to quantify, and make it tangible, the benefits that it's bringing elsewhere. So setting a kind of, time frame for things, I think, is very challenging.
It's tricky as well in terms of that drive for net zero emissions as well, because it's something everyone's really getting behind. There are targets in place. I'm going to say something quite controversial, sorry, but if we achieve that by purchasing solar panels from overseas, that actual long-term effect, we're just kind of pushing something into a different problem corner.
Yeah.
So I think the problem with a timescale, I'm not saying we need to slow down, it's the opposite, so this is the controversy, but the problem with a timescale is one rushes. And there may be knock-on effects of certain decisions and certain pushes for certain technologies at the moment that actually the longer-term carbon effects on a whole are a much larger scale than actually the positive impact that they may have in the short term. And I think that's, again, one of those complexities that's so hard to navigate, especially on the scale that we're talking about today, in terms of the whole built environment. And you have to push for something. I just think that there needs to be a caution in terms of actually this is a problem that's being it's a cumulative problem. So sometimes a decision now doesn't have an impact for decades, but we've got to start thinking about, it goes back to that whole life, that longer term, the short term, the medium, and that long term effect, and see if we can try and tie a thread without rushing to something that we then try and undo for the next set of targets. I think that's really important.
Yeah, very.
This is why I think the Edinburgh Carbon Commission report has said that the effect of insulating existing buildings is so much more than installing solar panels. Yeah. If you look at it as a quantity, even though the temptation can be when you're addressing new projects, when you're looking at solutions, to list on a piece of paper that solar panels is a solution, and it is in the right context, but we need to be honest about how much and for how long.
Solar panels was just an example, by the way. Not attacking the PV industry. Just making sure.
No, but I think the timescale also offers the idea of an opportunity. So, for example, you're going into a building. Let's say Edinburgh, which is so full of very old buildings, and we want to keep them. So you're going into a building and you have the opportunity, that is your opportunity to do some good. Because right now, here we are, everybody's out, let's get some work done. And then if you don't call it right, and that's when you need to stop rather than rush, I think. Because that's when you need to think of, all right, what can I influence? I can influence the fabric, and we're going to do that. I can influence some of the services and so on and see how we can move things around in the space. And thus I can influence a lot of the final way that it looks and so on. Okay, however, somebody comes along and says, oh, there's this new product. Would you like to use it? And at that stage is when you need to really start thinking about it as a, long and short and so on. It's because in general, we only have 1 or 2 points where we can make changes and we can go and make design changes to a building. And so at that stage, you need to think, well, actually the bill might be 3 times more. How am I going to make the business case for that? Because if I don't do it now, I've got another 40 years before I can then touch it again. Mm. And so that's when you take the time to make that business case and say, this is it, and because of this medium, because of the long term. And we go back to both our pet peeves, VAT for refurbishment.
Exactly. I think it's interesting in terms of making those decisions as well, and going back to one of the points, just to tie back into something we said earlier about taking people with you on that journey. If you're investing as an organisation or as a client or a consumer in something, it is understanding the impact you're having, whether it's positive or negative. So not like a price tag on something, but almost how can we actually, when organisations are doing positive things, how can we communicate that in a positive way to take everyone with us on that journey? And it comes down to kind of visual literacy in the built environment, people actually understanding what a building is and how it functions. So there's a whole bigger problem there. But I think it's really interesting in terms of clients and organisations making those decisions is actually how can we how can buildings communicate to show people what they're achieving and what they're doing. I think that's a really key part in this, the comms, which actually ties things together and actually helps to educate and bring consumers with us as well, and helps to aid their decisions on different scales as well. So I think there's a tool missing somewhere in order to allow us to communicate those decisions in quite a nice way.
Okay, I'm just going to check if we've got our poll results. I think we might be having technical issues, so apologies for that. But I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating in the panel. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope it's been of value to everybody that's been watching in. As I said, it's been recorded, so please do check on to the YouTube channel for Cundall to see this, and as I say, any of the other World Green Building Week events that we've been hosting. So thank you, everyone. That's been brilliant.
Thank you.